The world can come at you fast and furious these days. You got the 24-hour news cycle, Twitter, people shouting on TV. Now, if that's what you want, this is not going to be your show. We're going to do global affairs a little differently. So, why don't you grab your coffee, sit for a little bit, and brew with me on something that I think will have a profound global impact. I'm Damien, and this is Coffee and World. Now, I've been thinking a lot about CRISPR lately. That's CRISPR. Heard of it? Neither did I until about 2 years ago when this happened.
When a Chinese scientist announced he had created the first living and breathing genetically modified babies, the scientific world reacted with shock and disdain.
That definitely raised a lot of eyebrows, as you can imagine. The Chinese can create super babies now? What genetic sorcery was this? It even shocked the Chinese government enough that they threw the Chinese scientist in jail for doing what he did. Yet just 2 years later, the 2020 Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, the co-discoverers of a new gene editing method. The very method that the Chinese scientists used to re-engineer the code of life. It wasn't sorcery at all. When a technology is democratized, it's going to shake things up, especially one that's as powerful and unique as CRISPR. It will create new markets, challenge social paradigms, and test our morality. Our genetic fates may no longer be entirely up to nature, but in the hands of human engineering. And the world's two superpowers will be at the center of it all. Yeah, that's some heavy stuff, right? So I'm going to do my best to separate the hype from reality, but first we got to start with a little bit of science. Like humans, bacteria need to fend off viruses too. And it's the bacteria's natural defense mechanism that holds the key to the breakthrough in gene editing. Ian Malcolm was right.
Life, finds a way.
And that way is CRISPR, or clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats. It's a mouthful and it's complicated, so I'm going to break it down to see why it matters. So DNA sequences are made up of 4 letters, A, T, C, and G. 3.2 billion of those letters are in the human genome. In a bacteria cell, there's an area where these letters are clustered closely together, but they're regularly spaced out, and they're the same forward and backward. Like a palindrome. So get it now? Clustered, regularly interspaced, short, palindromic, repeats. Okay, so it's a cool DNA sequence, but so what? Well, for that, we've got to turn to yogurt, or more precisely, the probiotic bacteria in the yogurt. That's all the rage these days, right? When Danish researchers experimented with probiotic bacteria in 2007, they were able to prove that CRISPR was somehow able to edit the bacteria's DNA to defend against viral intruders. Really exciting stuff, right? But how exactly did that work? Well, it turns out that CRISPR is a 2-part system. Think of it kind of like a missile defense system, right? You need the missile, and you also need a capable guidance function to be able to hit the target. That guidance function is the CRISPR RNA, which is sort of like DNA, but a little bit different. And if that sounds familiar to you, it's the basis for the COVID-19 vaccines we've made. And the CRISPR RNA behaves like a GPS system that finds the exact coordinates of where to cut in the DNA strand. And the cutting tool, or genetic scissors, is this Cas9 protein that's found with CRISPR. So that's the CRISPR-Cas9 system in a nutshell, an RNA guidance system plus genetic scissors. So what's revolutionary and Nobel Prize worthy of that? Well, that's where Doudna and Charpentier's 2012 seminal paper comes in. It took the biosciences community by storm. They were able to show that CRISPR was not just a defense mechanism. It is also a unique tool for editing all sorts of DNA sequences, including in us humans. And that tool has 2 unique functions: precision and programmability. The CRISPR RNA can be programmed to basically target any DNA sequence it wants. It's kind of the genetic equivalent of a word processor. Just bear with me for a second, okay? What you see on top is a DNA sequence of a healthy human. And what you see on the bottom is a sequence of somebody who has sickle cell anemia. a horrible genetic blood disease. A mutation in a single DNA letter, the T to the A, is what causes this disorder. What the CRISPR RNA does is like putting that cursor next to the T and then hitting the delete button with the scissors. And then replaces it with an A, and voila! Sickle cell anemia is gone. Now, analogies are obviously imperfect, but the value proposition of a tool like CRISPR-Cas9 is that it's cheap, easy, and accessible. The novelty of CRISPR isn't in its invention, but in its application and commercialization potential. Just like Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but he made the modern automobile a commercial success by applying what came before. So too with genetic editing. It's been around for decades, and various methods have been tried, but they were all expensive, hard to use, and not versatile. Until CRISPR-Cas9 came along. You can think of it sort of like a software platform even, possibly becoming the Microsoft Word of gene editing. To borrow from Mark Andreessen's famous essay a decade ago, is CRISPR-Cas9 going to eat the world? Well, the agriculture world is certainly using CRISPR on the things we eat. DuPont has made waxy corn, disease-resistant cocoa plants are in the works, naturally decaffeinated coffee beans, just knock out a gene in the plant. Spicy tomatoes, CRISPR can do that too. As you can see, the top owners of CRISPR patents are mainly US ag companies. Food security is a big challenge and big business globally. CRISPR can help feed people by raising yields and creating stronger crops. And few countries care as much about food security as China does. That's why by 2013, the Chinese government was already outspending the US government 2-to-1 on agriculture R&D. China already has something like 20 research groups focused on experimenting with CRISPR and crops. And just a few years later, a Chinese state firm bought leading global agribusiness Syngenta for a whopping $43 billion. That made it the largest foreign acquisition ever for China. Syngenta, of course, has an R&D team working on CRISPR. Chinese scientists have also ventured beyond crops into livestock. Some of you may know that China is a pork superpower, but it loses a lot of its hogs to disease each year. Sometimes those pigs end up in the Shanghai River. Well, genetic editing could possibly produce swine flu-resistant hogs. Pigs can also be engineered to do human organ transplants. That's because pigs' organs apparently are similar in size to ours. And we're not done just yet. CRISPR may be able to eradicate one of the most stubborn diseases in the modern world, malaria. A method called gene drive can theoretically be applied, and it's already being discussed in Africa. What you do here is you basically use CRISPR to create malaria-resistant mosquitoes, and then you set these altered mosquitoes out to pass on the trait to large populations. Over time, malaria hopefully just gets wiped out. CRISPR can also treat cancer, HIV, and maybe even progeria. That's the Benjamin Button disease. Remember that movie with Brad Pitt? So the point is, the commercial potential of this new tool is huge. Not just companies, industries will be built around it. From 2015 to 2019, venture capital in the US and Europe has poured some $75 billion into biotech. When it comes to CRISPR gene editing specifically, well, that global market is expected to be over $4 billion by 2024, about 10 times bigger than it was just in 2017. One of those industries falls under the category of gene therapeutics to treat diseases. And that market is already getting a little bit crowded. Startups are tapping financing, and incumbents are building up CRISPR capabilities, and that's all happening over the last few years. This CRISPR frenzy can be seen in global CRISPR patent applications. From 2013 to 2018, global CRISPR patent applications exploded 63 times. And surprise, surprise, the big three, America, Europe, and China, were leading the way. They made up some 70% of total CRISPR patent applications. So, CRISPR has gone global before it is fully mature. And this is where it gets really interesting. So everyone knows that the holy grail is altering the human genome. The opportunity set for improving human livelihoods is simply huge. But in chasing market share and new breakthroughs, social and ethical dilemmas and competitive dynamics have become more of an afterthought. Now, that's not entirely new either. That gap exists for any new transformative technology. But CRISPR elicits one of the most existential questions. What does it mean to be human? And what do we want to pass on as our legacy? Now, if you thought the issues around artificial intelligence were tough, just wait until CRISPR becomes more mainstream. Science fiction has long provided object lessons in dystopian futures that result from new technologies. And when news broke of the Chinese CRISPR twins, well, it seemed like we were kind of moving inexorably toward sci-fi territory. The reality, though, was a bit more prosaic. The Chinese scientists wanted to show mastery of CRISPR by editing out the gene that was receptive to HIV. And on face value, there was nothing really wrong or bad about that. In fact, many others saw the potential to knock out the HIV gene. That's why the overall response in the biosciences community was actually more mixed. Some had even heard that the Chinese scientist was working on something like it, but few thought that it would be done so soon and to be done in a human embryo. That had to do with the operating environment in China. Chinese companies and researchers, for example, can move faster because they don't have to face similar regulatory hurdles when it comes to clinical trials. It's what's called regulatory arbitrage. When it comes to cancer, for example, Chinese hospitals are racing to use CRISPR treatments on patients. Meanwhile, in the US and EU, clinical trials can be held up in regulatory purgatory for much longer. Beneath it all is the biotech ecosystem that's being built. Much of it is concentrated in what's come to be known as the Silicon Delta, or Shenzhen, really. And that's where big tech meets big biotech. Based there is one of the largest gene sequencing companies in the world, BGI Group. Just as AI algorithms need a lot of data to train, CRISPR experiments and research need access to actual genome sequences, and that's where BGI comes in. It has access to some 20 million samples of humans, plants, and animal gene sequences, and they're housed inside China's sprawling gene bank. And BGI can also sequence genomes much faster and cheaper now. So cheap, in fact, that BGI claims that it can sequence the entire human genome for just $600 today. The cost of doing that back in 2001, $95 million. And just how fast? Well, 40 hours. That's how long it took a virologist in Shanghai to sequence the entire COVID-19 genome back in January 2020. He apparently used next-generation gene sequencing technology that BGI says it has. This huge growth and potential of the Chinese biotech industry has certainly caught America's attention. This all but guarantees another source of US-China competition. Just look at this recent memo from the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. Now, if you swapped out AI and quantum here for biotech, frankly, it would work just as well. The argument goes something like this. China is investing heavily in X, and it's catching up. Dependence on Chinese technology poses risks and undermines US economic competitiveness. And that's not even getting to the E word. Yeah, eugenics. Well, at least that's the dystopian future portrayed in Gattaca, that iconic 1990s sci-fi flick with DNA sequence in its title. If you remember, the plot of the movie portrayed a future of inequality sorted by genetic superiority or weaknesses. That's probably one of those national security scenarios being whispered as we speak. What if China creates super soldier unit with better muscle development and immune to diseases? You know, like Captain China? What if they create super IQ children that outcompete us all? Guess it all comes back to the super babies then. Science, fortunately, is more rational and conservative than science fiction. It's iterative, methodical, and has a lot of trial and error. CRISPR-Cas9 was built on decades of research. It wasn't a eureka moment. And that new tool was actually right under our nose the whole time. It was nature's own creation. But genetic manipulation is complex stuff, and our understanding of genetics is far from complete. It's not entirely clear that these sci-fi futures would ever become a reality. At a minimum, it seems very far away. Still, the CRISPR genie cannot be put back into the bottle. That technology is democratized, and so will the new knowledge and innovations built upon it. If we can't prevent CRISPR's diffusion, then the best we can do is think harder about what we should and shouldn't do with it. And the CRISPR baby's case highlighted the should question like no other. The growing consensus in the biosciences community seems to be putting a red line between somatic cell editing and germline editing. Somatic cells affect only the individual presently, while germline editing means those changes and traits get passed on to future generations. This unnatural selection gets into thorny territory. Should people pass on edited genes that they didn't choose in the first place? So it seems like gene editing of human embryos, whether it's for cosmetic changes like height or eye color, or other superior features, is probably a no-go zone. The Chinese government seems to largely agree, judging by the action they took on the Chinese scientists when the CRISPR babies were revealed. Even Vladimir Putin seems to take a stand against super soldiers. But simply demarcating a line may not be enough. What if some countries, say, have designer baby zones where parents can go there and get their embryos' genes edited? South Korea, for example, is already a popular destination for cosmetic surgery tourism, and it also seems to be a growing market for CRISPR. With the prevalence of in vitro fertilization, much of this seems within reach over the next decade. Or even now, it's not that difficult to use CRISPR, so people can, and some already are, editing genes in their basements. Yep, with CRISPR kits they can buy off of Amazon. Now, that seems like a security risk worth thinking about. None of this is just about competing with China. The diffusion of a powerful technology requires a collective response on how to deal with it. The trick for governments and regulators is always about finding that balance. You want to be able to mitigate a downside sensibly without stifling the incredible upsides and innovation that this new technology brings. With these genetic scissors, we can do a lot of good by editing out the bad letters in our genetic code. And nature has made us all mutants of one sort or another. But now, we have the power to make us better mutants. In a quest to improve human livelihoods through technology, we should not forget what makes us human. The Chinese scientist may be the first to have created CRISPR babies. He certainly was not the only one contemplating it. Rather than move fast and break things, when it comes to genetic editing, perhaps it is best to move methodically and fix the right things. Now that you've stuck with me through CRISPR, let's hop over to Milan. I think Sofia is ready to take some espresso shots and do some trash talking. Till next time.
Ciao, and welcome to Coffee and the World. In the time it takes to make my espresso, I'll get you up to speed on those global matters that matter, but you probably haven't thought much about. In case you haven't figured it out, I'm Italian, and we like our coffee in concentrated small doses and from the mocha, obviously the only right way to make your coffee. But it's not just the right way to make coffee, it's also doing right by the environment, because you don't have to use these things. You might wonder, don't these capsules just get recycled? Well, yes and no. These coffee capsules, and much of what we throw out every day, is part of a huge business globally. But that is not as sustainable as it seems. This is how it works. My recycling gets picked up here in Milan. Some of it goes to a closed processing plant, but a lot of it leaves on a ship bound for, drumroll, China. When the shipping containers arrive at their destination, swarms of Chinese mom and pop buyers, as well as larger companies, buy the trash and transform it into raw materials. Those materials then get sold to manufacturers to produce new products, say a new coffee capsule. And then that coffee capsule is shipped right back to Milan again, and the circle goes on and on. I know what you're thinking. It seems like the West is just dumping its trash in China. But in reality, this trashy business was for a long time embraced by both the importer and exporter alike. For countries like the EU, it was simpler and cheaper to export their scrap abroad because the cost of processing it at home was much higher. And for China, that recycled stuff from abroad was often of higher quality and was especially needed to feed its booming manufacturing. This is why, since the 1990s, China has grown to command nearly half the global market share in recycled plastic and paper imports. And the domestic market for trash was so good that it even minted the first Chinese female billionaire, who was crowned the trash queen. Yet, what seemed like a perfect arrangement wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, and everything changed when China launched its National Sword campaign in 2017, which banned all foreign waste imports in a single year. This move may have shocked some, but there were signs pointing to this outcome. First, the trash trade was taking an environmental toll. Roughly 30% of the waste that arrived in China from the US in 2016 wasn't actually recyclable, mostly because it was contaminated and unusual. And an estimated 1.5 million metric tons of plastic, the equivalent of 150 Eiffel Towers, ended up off China's coast each year. Second, importing trash became less necessary, as Chinese consumers were getting richer, thus generating more of their own trash. So, now that the music has stopped in China, who was going to take these boatloads of trash? Southeast Asia, it turned out. Between 2016 and 2018, plastic exports to that region skyrocketed, but with much less capacity than China to process trash, countries like Malaysia and Vietnam landfilled or dumped in open air 70% of that waste. And unsurprisingly, they soon decided to shut the door on imported trash too. If nothing else, China's ban has shined a light on the irony that has long underpinned the recycling industry. What was supposed to be a sustainable practice was, in practice, held together by an unsustainable system. And demand for developed countries' waste may never return to its sites. So now what? Well, we must take care of our own trash now, of course, but how? Policies can help, like the EU's abolition of single-use plastic and its Circular Economy Action Plan. But investing in domestic capacity will be even more crucial. The trash trade with China was taken so much for granted that when the country brought down the sword in 2017, 60 US cities had to stop their recycling programs because they simply couldn't keep up with the new volumes of waste. The good news is that investing in waste management won't be a wasted investment. The US recycling industry generated $110 billion in 2018, about the same as the global entertainment industry's revenues. Obviously, it's not as glitzy as Hollywood, but the incentives are there to incentivize the sustainability of this industry. And given the impact it has on our lives, I think we also have an individual role to play too. Just like in recent years, many have become more conscious consumers, wanting to know where stuff comes from, now we also have a chance to become more conscious wasters, thinking about where stuff ends up. And the coffee you have each day isn't a bad place to start. Also, I think mine might be ready. Until next time on Espresso Shots, and buona giornata!